22. The Wars of Louis IV. The Peace of Utrecht, 1713. Before 1700, from the outset of his reign, Louis pursued a vigorous foreign policy. The quarrel between the House of France and the House of Habsburg had gone on for more than a century. When Louis XIV assumed his personal rule in 1661, Spanish territories still faced France on three sides: northeast, east, and south. But Spain was so weakened that this fact was no longer a menace to France. Indeed, the surrounding Spanish territories were now a temptation to French expansion. Louis XIV could count on popular support in France, for the dream of a frontier on the Rhine and the Alps was captivating to Frenchmen. He struck first in 1667 by sending a large army into the Spanish Netherlands. He was blocked, as noted earlier, by 376 the Triple Alliance of the Dutch, the English, and the Swedes. With strength renewed by reforms at home and in alliance now with Charles II of England, Louis struck again in 1672, the Dutch War, invading the Dutch provinces on the Lower Rhine, and this time raising up against him his great adversary, the Prince of Orange. William III, bringing the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs, Brandenburg, and Denmark into alliance with the Dutch Republic, forced Louis to sign the Treaty of Nimwegen 1903 in 1678. The French gave up their ambitions against Holland, but took from Spain the rich province of Franche-Comté, which outflanked Alsace on the south, and brought French power to the borders of Switzerland. See map P. 155. In the very next year, Louis further infiltrated the dissolving frontier of Vaud, the Holy Roman Empire, this time in Lorraine and Alsace. By the Peace of Westphalia, the French king had rights in this region, but the terms of that treaty were so ambiguous that claims could be made in contrary directions. In 1681, French troops occupied the city of Strasbourg, which, as a free city of the Holy Roman Empire, regarded itself as an independent little republic. A protest went up throughout Germany against this unprovoked invasion. But Germany was not a political unity. Since 1648, each German state conducted its own foreign policy, and at this very moment, in 1681, Louis XIV had an ally in the Elector of Brandenburg, forerunner of the kings of Prussia. The Diet of the Holy Roman Empire was divided between an anti-French and a pro-French party. The Emperor, Leopold I, was distracted by developments in the East. The Hungarians, incited and financed by Louis XIV, were again rebelling against the Habsburgs. They appealed to the Ottoman Turks, and Ottoman forces in 1683 moved up the Danube and besieged Vienna. Louis XIV, if he did not on this occasion positively assist the Turks, ostentatiously declined to join the proposed crusade against them. French incursions into the Holy Roman Empire 377. The Habsburg Emperor, with Polish assistance, was able to push the Ottoman army out of Austria. Returning to his western problems and observing the western border of the empire crumbling, Franche-Comté already lost, the Spanish Netherlands threatened, and Lorraine and Alsace absorbed bit by bit, the Emperor Leopold gathered the Catholic powers into a combination against the French. The Protestant states at the same time, aroused by the French revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, and by Huguenot émigrés who called down the wrath of God on the perfidious Sun King, began to ally them more readily with William of Orange. Catholic and Protestant enemies of Louis XIV thus came together in 1686 in the League of Augsburg, which comprised the Holy Roman Emperor, the kings of Spain and of Sweden, the electors of Bavaria, Saxony, and the Palatinate, and the Dutch Republic. In 1686, the King of England was still a protégé of France, but 3 years later, when William became king in England, that country too joined the League. The War of the League of Augsburg began in 1688. The French armies won battles, but could not drive so many enemies from the field. The French navy could not overpower the combined fleets of the Dutch and English. Louis XIV found himself badly strained. It was at this time that he first imposed direct taxes on the French nobles, and finally made peace at Ryswyck in the Netherlands in 1697, leaving matters about where they had been when the war began. The War of the League of Augsburg. In all the warring and negotiating, the question had not been merely the fate of this or that piece of territory, nor even the French thrust to the east, but the eventual disposition of the whole empire of Spain. The Spanish king, Charles II, prematurely senile, defied all expectations by living on year after year. The greatest diplomatic issue of the day was thus still unsettled, and his long-awaited death, in 1700, soon led to a long war for control of the Spanish throne and Spain's vast colonial empire. The War of the Spanish Succession, 378. The War of the Spanish Succession lasted 11 years, from 1702 to 1713. It was less destructive than the 30 Years' War, for armies were now supplied in more orderly fashion, subject to more orderly discipline and command, and could be stopped from 194 fighting at the will of their governments. Except for the effects of civil war in Spain and of deadly famines in France, the civilian populations were generally spared from violence and destruction. In this respect, the war foreshadowed the typical warfare of the 18th century, fought by professional armies rather than by whole peoples. Among wars of the largest scale, the War of the Spanish Succession was the first in which religion counted for little, the first in which commerce and sea power were the principal stakes, and the first in which English money was liberally used in continental politics. It was also the first that can be called a world war, because it involved the overseas world together with the leading powers of Europe. Wars within Europe were becoming linked to the global competition for colonies and trade. The struggle had long been foreseen. The two main aspirants to the Spanish inheritance were the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. Each had married a sister of the perpetually moribund Charles II, and each could hope to place a younger member of his family on the throne of Spain. During the last decades of the 17th century, the powers had made various treaties agreeing to partition the Spanish possessions. The idea was, by dividing the Spanish heritage between the two claimants, to preserve the balance of power in Europe. But when Charles II finally died, it was found that he had made a will, which stipulated that the Empire of Spain should be kept intact, that all Spanish territories throughout the world should go to the grandson of Louis XIV, and that if Louis XIV refused to accept in the name of his 17-year-old grandson, the entire inheritance should pass to the son of the Habsburg Emperor in Vienna. Louis XIV decided to accept. With Bourbons reigning in Versailles and Madrid, even if the two thrones were never united, French influence would now run from Belgium to the Straits of Gibraltar, and from Milan to Mexico and Manila. At Versailles, the word went out, the Pyrenees exist no longer. 379. The Pyrenees exist no longer. Never, at least in almost 2 centuries, had the political balance within Europe been so threatened. Never had the other states faced such a prospect of relegation to the sidelines. William III acted at once. He gathered the stunned or hesitant diplomats into the last of his coalitions, the Grand Alliance of 1701. Although he died the next year, before hostilities began, and with Louis XIV at the seeming apex of his grandeur, William had in fact launched the engine that was to crush the Sun King. The Grand Alliance included England, Holland, and the Austrian Emperor, supported by Brandenburg and eventually by Portugal and the Italian Duchy of Savoy. Louis XIV could count on Spain, which was generally loyal to the late king's will. Otherwise, his only ally was Bavaria, whose rivalry with Austria made it a habitual satellite of France. The Bavarian alliance gave the French armies an advanced position toward Vienna, and maintained that internal division within Germany that was fundamental to both the French ascendancy and the ongoing struggle to maintain an international balance of power. Threats to political balance. The war was long, mainly because each side no sooner gained a temporary advantage than it raised its demands on the other. The English, though they sent relatively few troops to the continent, produced in John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, a preeminent military commander for the Allied forces. The Austrians were led by Prince Eugene of Savoy. The Allies won notable battles at Blenheim in Bavaria, 1704, and at Ramillies, 1706, Oudenarde, 1708, and Malplaquet, 1709, in the Spanish Netherlands. The French were routed. Louis XIV asked for peace, but then would not agree to a treaty because the Allied terms were so enormous. Louis fought to hold the two crowns, to conquer the Spanish Netherlands, to get French merchants into Spanish America, and at the worst in 38 195 self-defense. After minor successes in 1710, he again insisted on controlling the crown of Spain. The Spanish fought to uphold the will of the deceased king, the unity of the Spanish possessions, and even the integrity of Spain itself. For the English moved in at Gibraltar and made a menacing treaty with Portugal. Meanwhile, the Austrians landed at Barcelona and invaded Catalonia, which, as in 1640, again rose in rebellion, recognizing the Austrian claimant to the Spanish throne, so that all Spain fell into civil war. Motives of the warring states. The Austrians fought to keep Spain under the control of the Habsburg family, to crush Bavaria, and to carry Austrian influence across the Alps into Italy. The Dutch fought as always for their security, to keep the French out of Belgium, and to control access to the river Scheldt. The English fought for these same reasons, and also to keep the French-supported Catholic Stuarts out of England and preserve the Revolution of 1688. It was to be expected that the Stuarts, if they returned, would ruin the Bank of England and repudiate the national debt. Both maritime powers, England and Holland, fought to keep French merchants out of Spanish America and to advance their own commercial position in America and the Mediterranean. These war aims made the Whigs the implacable war party in England, whereas the vaguely pro-Stuart and anti-commercial Tories were quite willing to make peace at an early date. As for the minor allies, Brandenburg and Savoy, their rulers had simply entered the alliance to gain such advantages as might turn up. The Peace of Utrecht. Peace was finally made at the treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt of 1713 and 1714. The Treaty of Utrecht, with its allied instruments, in fact partitioned the world of Spain, but it did not divide it between the two legal claimants only. The British remained at Gibraltar to the great irritation of the 381 Spaniards, and likewise annexed the island of Minorca. The Duke of Savoy eventually gained the former Spanish island of Sardinia in return for his contribution to the Allied cause. The rest of the Spanish Mediterranean holdings, Milan, Naples, and Sicily, passed to the Austrian Habsburgs, as did the Spanish Netherlands, or Belgium, subsequently referred to as the Austrian Netherlands. In Spain itself, shorn of its European possessions but retaining America, the grandson of Louis XIV was confirmed as king, Philip V of Spain, on the understanding that the French and Spanish thrones should never be inherited by the same person. The Bourbons reigned in Spain, with interruptions from Philip V to the Republican Revolution of 1931. French influence was strong in the 18th century, for a good many French courtiers, advisors, administrators, and merchants crossed the Pyrenees with Philip V. They helped somewhat to revive the Spanish monarchy by applying the methods of Louis XIV, and they passed a swelling volume of French manufactures through Seville into Spanish America. The partition of Spain's holdings Baccharis. The old objective of William III to prevent French domination of the Netherlands and of Europe was realized at last. The war itself was the main cause of French loss of strength. It produced poverty, misery, and depopulation, and it exposed Louis XIV to severe criticism at home. Recurring famines and tax increases provoked peasant uprisings, which were brutally repressed. Dissatisfaction with the war led also to a revival of aristocratic and parliamentary opposition. By the peace treaties, the French abandoned, for the time being, their efforts to conquer what now became the Austrian Netherlands. They ceased to recognize the Stuart pretender as King of Great Britain. They surrendered to the British two of their colonies, Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, called Acadia, and recognized British sovereignty in the disputed American Northwest, known as the Hudson Bay 196-382 territory. But the French were only checked, not downed. They retained the conquests of Louis XIV in Alsace and the Franche-Comté. Their influence was strong in Spain. Their deeper strength and capacity for recovery were soon evident in renewed economic expansion. Their language and civilization continued to spread throughout Europe. Consequences of the war for France. The Battle of Blenheim, portrayed here by the French émigré artist Louis Laguerre, 1663 to 1721, was fought in Bavaria in 1704. It was a great victory for the English and the Allied forces that had joined to oppose the French in the War of Spanish Succession. The English commander, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, is the central figure in Laguerre's painting. Blenheim brought fame and rewards to Marlborough, But for the French, it was the first in a series of military defeats that steadily weakened the power of Louis XIV. Print collector, Getty Images. The Dutch received guarantees of their security. They were granted the right to garrison the Dutch Barrier, a string of forts in the Austrian Netherlands on the side toward France. But the Dutch, strained by the war and outdistanced by England, never again played a primary role in European political affairs. Two other small states ascended over the diplomatic horizon, Savoy, or Piedmont, and Brandenburg. The rulers of 383, both for having sided with the victors, were recognized as kings by the Treaty of Utrecht. Savoy came to be known as Sardinia, and Brandenburg as Prussia. The greatest winners were the British. Great Britain made its appearance as a great power. The Union of England and Scotland had taken place during the war. Based at Gibraltar and Minorca, Britain was now a power in the Mediterranean. The southern Netherlands, the pistol pointed at the heart of England, was in the innocuous hands of the Austrians. The British added to their American holdings, but far more valuable than Newfoundland and Nova Scotia was the asiento extorted from Spain. The asiento granted the lucrative privilege, which the French had sought, of providing Spanish America with African slaves. Much of the wealth of Bristol and Liverpool in the following decades was to be built upon the slave trade. The asiento, by permitting one shipload of British goods to be brought each year to Portobello in Panama, also provided opportunities for illicit trade in non-human cargoes. Britain becomes a great power, 1907-384, A Peasant Interior by Louis Lenon, French, c. 1600 to 1648. Although Lenon portrayed this peasant family in the 1640s, the people in this painting resemble the peasants who later suffered through wars, famines, and tax increases in the last decades of the long reign of Louis XIV. Source: National Gallery of Art. The Spanish Empire was pried open, and British merchants entered on an era of wholesale smuggling into Spanish America, competing strenuously with the French, who, because of their favored position in Spain, were usually able to go through more legal channels. Moreover, the British, by defeating France, assured themselves of a line of Protestant kings and of the maintenance of constitutional and parliamentary government. The ratification of the Peace of Utrecht actually marked a further step in the evolution of English constitutional history. The Whigs, who were the main supporters of the war with France, thought the treaty insufficiently favorable to England. The Tories, pledged to peace, had won the House of Commons in 1710, but the Whigs continued to control the House of Lords. Queen Anne, at the request of Tory leaders and in the interests of peace, raised 12 Tory commoners to the peerage in order to create a Tory majority in the Lords, and hence to obtain ratification of the treaty. This established itself as a precedent. It became an unwritten article of the British Constitution that when the Lords blocked the Commons on an important issue, the monarch could create enough new Lords to make a new majority in that House. After 1713, the Lords never again allowed themselves to be swamped by newcomers, and thus acceded in all future disputes to the will of the Commons. The landed aristocracy and their merchant allies could now govern as they saw fit. The result was a rapid increase of wealth in England, precipitating within a few generations a veritable industrial revolution. 1 in Tiny 8, 385, The Atlantic World After the Peace of Utrecht, 1713. The map shows the partitioning of the Spanish Empire and the rise of the British. Spain and its American possessions went to the Bourbon Philip fief. The European possessions of Spain, the Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and Sicily, went to the Austrian Habsburgs. Britain, meanwhile, was strengthened by the union of England and Scotland, the acquisition of Minorca, Gibraltar, and the commercial privilege of the asiento from Spain, and of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia from France. The French, for their part, had taken control of rich Caribbean lands in Santo Domingo, through an earlier treaty with Spain. 1909. Except for the addition of England, the same powers were parties to the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 as to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and they now confirmed the system of international relations established by Westphalia. The powers accepted each other as members of the European system, recognized each other as sovereign states connected only by free 386 negotiation war, and treaty, and adjusted their differences through rather facile exchanges of territory, made in the interests of a balance of power, and without regard to the nationality or presumed wishes of the peoples affected. With Germany still in extreme fragmentation, Italy divided into minor states or controlled by foreign kings, and Spain subordinated to France, the Treaty of Utrecht left France and Great Britain as the two most vigorous imperial powers of Europe. These countries soon became the two principal carriers and exporters of the European civilization that would spread its empires, commerce, institutions, and ideas throughout much of the modern world. In the next chapter, we look at how the societies of Central and Eastern Europe developed along lines of their own, even when they were strongly influenced by the growing power and wealth of the Western European states.